Hello, and welcome to the Dance Physio Podcast, a podcast designed to explore ideas and foster discussion around dancer health and wellness. We're here to challenge the status quo, bridge the gap between dance science and the studio, and help change the landscape of the dance industry for the better. I'm your host, Erika Mayall, a dancer turned physiotherapist who is deeply passionate about leaving the dance world better than I found it. I'm so glad you're here. Let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Dance Physio Podcast. I am your host, Erika Mayall. Before we get into this week's podcast topic, I just want to remind you to take a second to go leave a review or a rating for the podcast if you have not done so already. One of my goals this year is to increase the number of reviews and ratings on the major podcast platforms. So whether that be Apple Podcasts, Spotify, whatever podcast platform you listen to your podcasts on. I don't have a concrete numbers goal in mind necessarily, but I do have a goal of just increasing how many ratings and reviews that we have for the podcast. So if you have not done that yet, take 2 seconds, go back to the platform that you're listening to this on right now and leave a review, or even just a rating is totally fine. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your support. All right. This week, we're going to dive into talking about my treatment philosophy, or how I approach treatment for dancers working as a dance-specific physiotherapist. And this is actually a question that I get fairly frequently when people are contacting the clinic asking about options for treatment for their dancers, and whether it's a parent reaching out or whether it's a dancer reaching out. And most recently, I had a conversation with a dancer, an adult dancer, who reached out and sort of said, I've been to physio. This is kind of what I've been dealing with. This is sort of like the treatment approach. What can you offer me that is different in terms of treatment and rehabilitation? Because they, had a little bit of success with a previous physiotherapist that they had seen, but not as much as they were hoping. And so they wanted to reach out and ask these questions ahead of time. Just as an aside, or it's not really an aside, but if you ever are wanting to know if somebody is a good fit for you, like a practitioner, I encourage you to reach out and ask these questions. I welcome these questions. I don't specifically offer a discovery call option in my scheduling or in my booking system. A lot of clinicians do offer something like that, like a free 10 or 15 minute discovery call just to see if you're a good fit. But if somebody reaches out to me, whether that is by email or like a phone call or anything like that, I am more than happy to take the time and figure out if we are a good fit, because having a good fit in terms of a clinician and client relationship is really important for the success of rehabilitation. But it got me thinking that it's been a while since I've kind of talked a little bit about myself as a physiotherapist or as a clinician. So I just wanted to spend this week's podcast talking a little bit about my approach or my philosophy behind how I see treatment and rehabilitation and things like that. The very, 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 very first episode of the podcast ever, so episode 1, was all about my journey as a dance physiotherapist. And so that podcast episode is probably the last time that I've ever talked about any of this stuff. And that was a little bit more just about my background and my educational journey. So in that episode, I dive a lot into growing up as a dancer and how I got interested in dance physiotherapy, and then what my kind of training pathway and even continuing education and things like that have looked like. So if that's kind of what you're interested in, or you haven't listened to that yet and you're kind of interested in the earlier parts of my career or how I got to do what I am doing today, go back, have a listen to episode 1. It is one of my most downloaded episodes of all time, even though it was, 104 or 113 episodes ago, I guess. I will link it in the show notes here. But today what I want to talk about is a little bit more, not so much what courses I've taken and what skills I have, but my approach or my philosophy, I'm calling it. I don't know if that's the right word, but my approach to how I see rehabilitation, or what my priorities are, especially when I'm working with dancers. So, number 1, I always endeavor to treat the whole person. And you'll hear this called like a whole person approach to treatment and stuff sometimes. I actually have a friend and a colleague who teaches courses in the realm, like she teaches for physios and athletic therapists and stuff. Her name is Anna, and she has a company called the Movement Rev. If you're a clinician and you've never taken any courses with Anna, she's brilliant. I highly recommend it. And she talks a lot about a whole organism approach, and that's kind of the terminology that she uses. I often just think about it as treating the whole person. And when I say that, I think it is so important for us to really understand and know the person behind the dancer. And so often in the dance world, it's so easy to think about somebody as a dancer first, and that is like their identity. And sometimes our identities get wrapped up in being a dancer. But when we are thinking about whether it's like rehabbing from an injury or even like prehab, or if we're working on goal setting with dancers and things like that, it's really important to understand the person behind the dancer, because you are a person first and a dancer second. And so we need to take that into consideration and into account. And so my treatments might vary depending on who the person in front of me is. They are never going to look exactly the same from dancer to dancer, even if you are taking the same classes and training in the same program and training in the same styles. You are fundamentally different people. You are different than other people around you. And so our approach to how we work together is going to be different. And so I will always endeavor to treat the whole person or the whole organism, but really get to know the person behind the dancer, or like who you are as a person and what your priorities are and what strategies work best for you and what approaches to learning work best and all of those types of things, because I can diagnose your injury correctly and give you all of the right kind of rehabby type stuff. But if it doesn't take into account factors that make you who you are, that's not always going to be successful. There's a lot of people who need things presented to them in a different way, and that might be how and when they do their exercises, or that might be how much information you're feeding them at any one given time, or all sorts of different things factor into it. But I always really try and get to know my dancers in that sense so that we can have this kind of like whole person approach to working together. If you have ever seen me in the clinic, you'll know that I am really chatty. Well, I don't know if chatty is the right word. I ask a lot of questions. And that is part of me getting to know you. And I think sometimes, if it's younger dancers especially, sometimes I think they maybe get a little bit like, why is she interrogating me about, so many things? And it might be things about where you dance, your favorite styles of dance, what competitions you like. But it also might be like, what's your favorite color? Who are your friends you hang out with? Like, it could be anything and everything under the sun. And that really is part of getting to know you as a person and not just a dancer. So that's number one in terms of my approach or my philosophy to treatment or working with a dancer. Number two is I'm always looking to find the root cause of an issue. And so we might have a dancer who comes in who says, I don't know what a good example is. I feel like I always use ankle sprains as an example, but let's say a dancer comes in and says, I just have like chronically tight hamstrings. My hamstrings are always tight. I stretch all the time. I'm doing all of the things and my hamstrings are just tight and they're getting sore and they're always the thing that bugs me and it feels like they're limiting me in my dance. It would be really easy to hone in on the hamstrings and do, maybe soft tissue work for the hamstrings, or maybe work on some needling for the hamstrings and do a lot of stretching and maybe even throw in some nerve glides or all of the things that specifically focus on this tightness in the hamstring. But more often than not, there's going to be something that's causing that to be a recurring issue. So when somebody comes in and says, this is my problem, yes, I'm going to listen to them and take it at face value to some degree, but I'm always then going to go back to their body and what the body is telling me. And so
assessments don't always look exactly like I think people might expect them to. I might not look directly at the hamstrings to start with because I'm going to try and find out what the root cause of this issue is. And so it could be, it could be anything under the sun. It could be that they have, stiffness in their ankle joint and therefore the hamstring is, trying to compensate for that. They could be weak in their core muscles. They could be in some sort of a protection pattern. They could have something going on more centrally. I'm going to talk about this in a second, but we have to consider like the nervous system or even the visceral system. So that's like the organs in the body and the fascial system and all of these things and how they interplay together. So one of my priorities is always trying to figure out what the root cause of something is and not just kind of having a Band-Aid fix, because yes, stretching your hamstrings is probably temporarily going to help. But if we don't address the root cause, they're likely just going to keep tightening up again and again and again. So if you are coming in and presenting with something like tight hamstrings, don't be surprised if what you are given in terms of treatment and home exercises and things like that doesn't look like a whole lot of hamstring stretching necessarily. It might look different depending on what the kind of root cause of the issue is. I always try my best to educate and explain this to the people, the dancers that I'm working with, because I know that it can feel a little bit confusing, or I have people who come into the clinic sometimes who have seen other therapists in the past and they feel like they haven't been heard because they come and they say, well, I came in with this problem, but then they just got me to do X, Y, Z and it didn't seem related to the problem. Like they haven't necessarily educated the person on what that connection is. And sometimes because I have like clinical knowledge, I can actually see what that connection is. And I might say, do you know what? I actually think that was the exact right treatment option for you for these reasons. But it's really important that we're really clear and like educate the person in front of you about why it is that we're doing what we're doing so that they don't feel like they're not being heard. And so, like I said, I'm always going to try and be looking for the root cause of what is happening. But if I'm giving you things that seem really unrelated to the injury that you came in with, I'm going to do my best to explain what that connection is or why that is the root cause of the issue so that hopefully you understand that you are still being heard and we are addressing the problem, but we're addressing maybe the thing that is causing the problem and not just sort of applying a Band-Aid fix to it. So that's really important, finding the root cause of an issue. Number 3, in terms of kind of the pillars of my philosophy or whatever you want to call it, is I like to take a fairly nervous system-based approach to understanding how the body works. And so if anybody has done any education programs with me, and especially the Flexibility Foundations program, or even just taken the NeuroFlex Masterclass, you will know that this is the lens that I sort of see the body through in terms of knowing that the nervous system is queen. The nervous system controls everything in our body, and it either allows movement or restricts movement or allows things to happen or restricts things from happening depending on the degree of safety that it feels. So when we're dealing with, even if it is sort of a musculoskeletal issue like tight hamstrings or an ankle sprain or whatever it is that we're dealing with, we have to understand that all of that has an impact and an effect on the nervous system. And knowing and understanding that effect on the nervous system allows us to make sure that we can maximize treatment of these issues. So I'm always going to have a little bit of this nervous system based approach or nervous system lens. I actually will probably talk a lot more about this in the coming year, like maybe on social media. I think my plan is to kind of dive a little bit more into some of the neuro stuff. It is really cool and it's super powerful how effective it is. And like I said, if you've taken Flexibility Foundations, you know how effective some of those little like neuro drills or inputs into the nervous system, like what a massive difference they make in flexibility training. And this is the same approach that I'm using in treatments in clinic when I'm dealing with dancers and working with dancers, is we're always considering how the nervous system is affecting the body and how it is responding to any inputs that we are giving it. And number 4, one of my main goals when I'm working with dancers is to keep you dancing. I don't really have any interest in telling you that you can't, do X, Y, Z. And I know a lot of dancers have a lot of hesitation around seeking out medical attention because maybe they have had the experience, or they just know that it is pretty common for medical practitioners to often say, well, just take 2 weeks off dance, or take 6 weeks off dance, or, you shouldn't be dancing, or maybe pick another sport or activity. These are all things that dancers have heard from the people who are supposed to be helping them to continue to dance. So one of my priorities is going to be to keep you dancing as much as possible, as long as it is safe. So when people come in, it is very rare that I'm going to tell somebody to completely stop dancing. There are certainly times and situations where dancers may actually need to completely take a break from dancing as part of recovery. But dancers who work with me and have worked with me for over long periods of time will know that I don't say that very often. So if I am telling a dancer to completely take a break from dancing or completely stop, generally they're going to follow that advice because they know that it's not something I say lightly. There is a reason that I am saying that. More often than not, I am going to find ways for you to keep dancing, even if it looks modified or we're having to make accommodations for whatever injury it is that we're dealing with. I've done an entire podcast episode. Actually, I'll link that one in the show notes too. I couldn't tell you what episode number it is, but I will look it up and link it in the show notes. But it's all about like why dance is so great for people recovering from an injury because of how many modifications we can make to it. So from a rehab perspective, I am going to keep you dancing as much as possible. One of the benefits of working with a dance-specific physiotherapist is that I can help with those modifications. I understand the structure of classes and the steps that you're doing and which ones we need to modify or which ones we need to limit. Versus if you're seeing somebody who doesn't really know dance, they're going to say, well, I don't know, dance seems pretty hard. You do like a lot of really like impressive things in it. It's probably like a bit much for this type of injury, without them being able to break down, okay, these are the parts that are too hard, but all of this stuff you can still do very, very safely. So one of my priorities is always to keep dancers engaged as much as possible. Dance is also like a really, really great rehab tool. So at some point, the lines get a little bit blurred between what is rehab and what is dance. And that should be the case. That should be how we progress to returning to full capacity. Telling a dancer to take 2 weeks off, but then not preparing them in any way for that return back to activity, and then just saying, okay, I took my 2 weeks off, now I'm jumping back into class at full throttle, that does not help prepare them to return to class. So we want to keep you dancing as much as possible, as much as is safe, but maybe with modifications or restrictions on certain things that we should not be doing. So if you come to the clinic, or anybody who walks through our clinic doors, especially who are dancers, but this also applies to other like artistic athletes that we work with as well, we are going to try and keep you doing the most possible. So hopefully not being scared of being told to just quit your activity or stop dancing altogether. Hopefully that removes that as a barrier to dancers seeking treatment, because they know that we're really going to try and keep them engaged as much as possible. And then finally, in terms of philosophies or whatever we want to call them, the other thing that is a really big pillar of rehabilitation, or how I practice in my clinic, is that the rehab, I'm just going to use the word rehab, but it's not always people who are recovering from injuries. Like, we work a lot with dancers who are just in to work on certain goals they have and progressing their dance. It's not always because of injuries, but I'm using the word rehab loosely. But our rehabilitation should prepare you for the demands of dance. This is probably the number one thing that I see with dancers who have gone to maybe a non-dance specific healthcare provider to deal with an injury is they often get correct diagnosis, sometimes not if it's something really specific to dancers, but more often than not, they are getting diagnosed appropriately. But the things that they are being given for recovery and rehab and like exercises and that type of thing usually are not functional enough to prepare the dancer for the demands of dance. So an example for this is oftentimes if people are having hip issues, and I'm just picking a random injury, but this happens with all sorts of injuries, people having, say, like a hip issue, they might be given sort of like, I'm using air quotations right now, you can't see me, but I'm going to say hip strengthening exercises. But they're often just given things like maybe some glute bridges and maybe some clamshells. And if we think about the demands of dance, what we are asking our hips to do is infinitely harder than doing a clamshell or a glute bridge. And so if those are the types of things that you're being given in rehab, and then you're being cleared to go back to dance, and you're dancing, at a level much, 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 much higher than that, or the demands are much higher, it's no wonder that so many people then experience like a flare-up or an exacerbation of their symptoms when they return to dance or feel like they did not fully recover. Same holds true, and this is probably actually the one I see more commonly, is a dancer who sprains their ankle. Again, correct diagnosis, go to see a therapist of some sort. They often get really good treatment in the acute phase, so it's like managing swelling and bruising and working on the range of motion and all of that kind of stuff. Great, no problems there. But then when it comes to preparing them for the demands of dance, they're often just given like TheraBand exercises to work on ankle strengthening. Again, I'm using strengthening in quotation marks. And if we think about what a dancer requires of their foot and ankle in dance settings, doing some little seated TheraBand exercises using, often like one of the lighter resistance bands is not going to be adequate. They often aren't doing anything in weight bearing, and they're certainly not challenging weight bearing to the degree that we challenge it in dance. They may not be working at full demi-point height or considering like the range needed and the strength and stability needed for point or things like that. So our rehab should be able to prepare us for the demands of dance. So we want it to be really functional, and that more often than not means we need to progress things into functional positions for dancers, and a lot of times that means in weight bearing. So if your whole rehab program looks like you doing nothing but exercises lying down on the floor or on a bed, that probably is not preparing you adequately. Those can be excellent first steps, and we certainly are going to use those types of exercises and approaches in the beginning stages of an injury, but it should be progressing to more functional things that are harder, things that more closely mimic what the demands are in dance class. It doesn't have to look exactly like dance, but it's thinking about those demands. So do we need to be able to accelerate and decelerate with control? Do we need to be able to shift our weight? Do we need to be able to respond on a stable leg to our center of gravity moving around that leg? What are the demands of dance, and how do we then create rehabilitation programs that mimic that and prepare us for it? The other thing, when we think about like it preparing us for dance, is especially if somebody has had an acute injury, and I'm just going to use the example of an ankle sprain because it's so easy for me. If they've had an acute injury, they've had an ankle sprain, they're getting to the point where they're like starting to be able to progress to dance, they should, in my opinion, and in terms of like how I approach treatment, they should be trying things as part of their rehab program, or like working on things as part of their rehab program before it gets introduced in the studio. And so oftentimes, and again, at the later stages of rehab, there's kind of a blurring of lines between what is like return to dance and progressive returning to the studio and what is still considered rehab. Like that becomes very blurry and very overlappy, and that's fine. But I will never progress somebody in the studio with something that we've not done in rehab, that they have not tried and done in a controlled setting. So for instance, jumping is a big one that we see. And so dancers will have done, say, again, ankle sprain, we'll just continue on the same theme, sprain their ankle, maybe they've done the strengthening, they've done some like rises, they've gotten their calf and ankle strength back to like a good level. If they have not then reintroduced impact-y type activities, they shouldn't be doing them in class. And I see this all the time with dancers who are like, oh yeah, like I got told that I can just go back to class and do everything. And, maybe they have improved their strength and all of that's there. But that's not the same as doing things like jumping or things like point work or things like whatever it is, turns or whatever, in a controlled, more rehab setting. So yes, there is this blurring of lines. And sometimes I'm not necessarily going to give a dancer turns as a home exercise. I might, but I don't always. But I'm still going to put rehab type parameters on those turns. So I may say, okay, the first 3 days back at class, you can do turn preps, but you're just going to hold it as a balance. You're not going to turn. Then for the next 3 days or 5 days or whatever it is, you're going to add a half turn when there's turns happening in class. Then you're going to add a single turn. Then you're going to progress that to a double turn or whatever. So I'm still giving them what I would consider like rehab protocols or parameters, but maybe they're doing it in class while the rest of the class is doing a turning exercise, as opposed to them doing it as a home exercise. So again, lines can be blurry, but there should be some preparation in controlled environments before we just throw them into class and say, you're cleared to do everything in class. And then along with this as well, and maybe this is actually just the whole reason behind all of this and preparing them for the demands of dance, is we need to make sure that the nervous system feels safe. If our nervous system does not feel safe, we are not going to be able to perform at our highest potential. And one of the things, and especially somebody who's had an acute injury, so say they've sprained their ankle, we want to make sure that their nervous system feels confident, feels safe, feels ready to go back and do the things in class. And oftentimes that actually means practicing and exposing them purposely to the moves that they were injured on. So whether it was a turn or whether it was landing from a jump or whatever it is, we often need to purposely take a dancer through those types of movements in order for their nervous system to understand that, yes, I am safe doing this. This is a controlled environment. We can build up that safety versus just throwing them back to class. They might think that they're doing it properly, but the body, the nervous system is protecting, it's holding back, it's compensating, it's feeling unsafe. And then we see things spiral from there sometimes. So that is probably, I guess, the rationale behind making sure that our rehabilitation is going to prepare you for the demands of dance. One of the biggest reasons for that is making sure that the nervous system feels safe. And a lot of that is making sure that the dancer has gone through the movements and the steps and the physical demands of what it is we're asking in a controlled environment before returning to class settings. So that is my sort of fifth kind of philosophy behind my sort of approach to treatment. Obviously, then within treatment, when I'm talking about like how we're working with dancers and stuff, that then I have, specific skill sets. So whether that's manual therapy skill sets or whether that is like exercise and loading modifications and things like that, or I use dry needling, or sometimes it's referred to as IMS or trigger point needling. Like I use needling in my practice. Like I said, a lot of education, a lot of what we do is education based. So there are specific treatment modalities that we will utilize. But all of these are based in these kind of like 5 pillars of philosophy of how I approach working with dancers. So I hope you found that interesting. I'm sure this applies a lot more maybe to clinicians, but I do think for dancers or even dance parents, understanding what to look for or whether to, like, you know, how to figure out if a clinician is a good fit for you, don't be afraid to ask questions about what their approach to treatment is. Or if you are seeing a clinician and you feel like you are maybe missing some steps of rehab, like the exercises are maybe not challenging enough for what the demands of dance are, or you feel like you're, you know, being cleared to do something that you don't feel confident or ready to do, ask questions and sort of have that conversation and say, hey, are there other things that we can do to kind of meet these or fill this gap or meet these demands? So hopefully that was informative for you. I know this is, again, like a little bit of a different style podcast episode than what I would normally do. Next week, I promise we're returning to regularly scheduled programming, we'll call it, episodes that are a little bit more kind of like condition focused and things like that. But if you have any questions or thoughts or feedback on today's episode, I would love to hear from you. Feel free to reach out to me. You can reach me on social media at Dance Physio Erika, Erika with a K, or send me an email. My email is in the show notes. Once again, thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate your time, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.